What happens when bullies decide to humiliate someone they think is defenseless, not knowing they're about to mess with a highly trained martial artist? This story will completely change how you view quiet students forever. At 17 years old, Keiko Nakamura moved through the hallways of Lincoln Technical High School, like a gentle breeze that barely disturbed the air around her. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with a slender build that seemed almost fragile, she possessed the kind of presence that people's eyes would slide past without really registering. Her straight black hair was always neatly braided down her back, and she favored simple, well-pressed uniforms that never drew attention to themselves. Everything about her appearance whispered of someone who preferred to blend into the background rather than stand out in any crowd. Lincoln Technical High was one of those sprawling urban schools where nearly 3,000 students created their own complex ecosystem of social hierarchies and unspoken rules. The building itself was a maze of concrete corridors lined with rows of dented lockers, fluorescent lights that flickered with the persistence of summer insects, and classrooms that smelled perpetually of industrial disinfectant and teenage anxiety. The student body was diverse in every way imaginable, from economic backgrounds that ranged from working-class families struggling to make ends meet to upper-middle-class professionals who saw the technical school as a stepping stone to prestigious universities. Within this concrete jungle, Keiko had carved out an existence that was notable primarily for its complete lack of notability. She arrived at school each morning at exactly 7:45, 15 minutes before the first bell, and made her way directly to her locker without stopping to chat with classmates or linger in the common areas, where social connections were typically forged. Her routine was as predictable as clockwork: retrieve her books for the morning classes, check her schedule one final time even though she had memorized it weeks ago, and slip into her first period classroom before the hallways became crowded with the rushing bodies of students who had cut their arrival times too close. During lunch periods, while other students clustered around tables in the cafeteria, sharing meals and gossip with equal enthusiasm, Keiko could invariably be found in the school library. She would claim a small table in the far corner, near the windows that looked out onto the school's modest courtyard, and spread out her homework assignments with the methodical precision of someone who approached education as both a privilege and a responsibility. Her lunch was always the same: a homemade bento box that her grandmother prepared each morning before leaving for her own job at the neighborhood grocery store, containing carefully arranged portions of rice, vegetables, and whatever protein they could afford that week. The other students at Lincoln Technical had learned to categorize Keiko in the way that teenagers instinctively sort their peers into manageable social boxes. To most of them, she was simply that quiet Asian girl who never caused problems, never spoke up in class discussions unless directly called upon, and never seemed to have opinions about anything that might generate conflict or controversy. She was neither popular nor unpopular, neither loved nor hated. She existed in that peculiar social limbo, reserved for people who make themselves so unremarkable that they become nearly invisible. What her classmates didn't know, couldn't possibly have guessed from her demeanor and appearance, was that Keiko's quiet nature wasn't born from shyness or social anxiety. It was the result of a discipline that had been instilled in her from childhood, a philosophy that emphasized observation over action, listening over speaking, and patience over impulsiveness. Every morning before school, while her classmates were hitting snooze buttons and rushing through abbreviated morning routines, Keiko rose at 5:30 to spend an hour in meditation and physical training that most people would find incomprehensible. Her grandmother, Hiromi Nakamura, was a woman whose small stature and gentle smile concealed a personal history that read like something from a dramatic novel. Born in Kyoto in 1945, she had grown up in post-war Japan during a time when traditional martial arts were experiencing a renaissance as the country rebuilt both its infrastructure and its cultural identity. Hiromi's father had been a judo instructor, before the war. And despite the social conventions that typically discourage girls from pursuing martial arts, he had recognized something special in his daughter's natural balance and fierce determination. By the age of 16, Hiromi had earned her black belt in judo, becoming one of the youngest female practitioners in her region to achieve that rank. She had competed in national tournaments, traveled throughout Japan demonstrating techniques at exhibitions, and had been on track to potentially represent her country in international competition when life took an unexpected turn. She met and fell in love with an American serviceman stationed in Japan, and when he returned to the United States, she made the difficult decision to follow him and start a new life in a country where her martial arts achievements meant little. And her accent made her an outsider in most social situations. Keiko's parents had died in a car accident when she was 11 years old, leaving Hiromi to raise her granddaughter alone on the modest income she earned from various part-time jobs. Rather than view this tragedy as an ending, Hiromi had seen it as an opportunity to pass on the traditions and skills that had shaped her own character. She began training Keiko in judo not as a recreational activity or a way to build confidence, but as a comprehensive system for developing both physical capabilities and mental discipline. The training took place in the converted basement of their small rental house, where Hiromi had installed proper mats and transformed the space into a traditional dojo complete with the formal protocols and rituals that were inseparable from authentic martial arts instruction. For 6 years, Keiko had trained under her grandmother's demanding but loving guidance, learning not just the throws, pins, and submission holds that comprise judo's technical curriculum, but also the philosophical foundations that emphasized respect, humility, and the responsible use of power. At 17, Keiko held a second-degree black belt, a rank that represented not just technical proficiency, but a level of understanding that most people spent decades trying to achieve. She could execute throws with the kind of precision that made them appear effortless, could read an opponent's intentions through subtle shifts in their posture and breathing, and possessed the kind of explosive power that could end confrontations in seconds. More importantly, she had internalized the mental discipline that taught her when to use these abilities and, perhaps more crucially, when not to use them. This was why she moved through Lincoln Technical High School with such deliberate invisibility. Every day, she witnessed the petty cruelties and social dynamics that flourished in environments where young people were still learning how to navigate relationships and establish their identities. She saw students who used verbal aggression to mask their own insecurities, observed the way certain individuals seemed to derive satisfaction from making others feel small or excluded, and recognized the patterns of behavior that could escalate from words to physical confrontation with startling rapidity. Her grandmother had taught her that true strength was demonstrated not through domination or intimidation, but through the wisdom to avoid conflicts that served no constructive purpose. The strongest fighter, Hiromi would say during their training sessions, is the one who never has to fight. This philosophy had become so deeply ingrained in Keiko's worldview that she approached potentially volatile situations with the same calm assessment she might use when analyzing a complex physics problem or working through a challenging mathematical equation. But philosophy and preparation, no matter how thorough, could not always prevent other people from making choices that would force her hand. And at Lincoln Technical High School, there were students who interpreted quiet dignity as weakness, who mistook careful restraint for fearfulness, and who were about to discover that their assumptions about the small, quiet girl in the corner were more dangerously incorrect than they could possibly imagine. The social hierarchy at Lincoln Technical High School operated according to unwritten rules that were as rigid as any formal code of conduct, and at the apex of this system stood a group of students who had learned to wield their influence with the casual cruelty that often accompanies unchecked power. Leading this informal coalition was Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez, a 6'2" senior whose nickname had been earned through a combination of his imposing physical presence and his tendency to bulldoze through obstacles, whether they were opposing players on the football field or underclassmen who happened to be standing in his way in the hallways. Tank's dominance wasn't built solely on size, though his broad shoulders and muscular frame certainly contributed to the aura of intimidation that preceded him wherever he went. At 18, he possessed the kind of natural athleticism that had made him the star linebacker on Lincoln Technical's football team, a position that came with significant social capital in a school where Friday night games were among the few sources of community pride in an otherwise economically struggling neighborhood. His success on the field had translated into leadership roles in student government, invitations to parties hosted by the most popular seniors, and the kind of deference from teachers and administrators that successful athletes often enjoy in American high schools. But Tank's true power came from his ability to read social situations and identify the most effective ways to assert his will over others. He had learned early in his high school career that direct physical confrontation, while sometimes necessary, was far less effective than psychological manipulation and the strategic use of humiliation. He could destroy someone's social standing with a well-timed comment in front of the right audience, could isolate potential rivals by spreading carefully crafted rumors that contained just enough truth to be believable, and could maintain his position at the top of the social food chain through a combination of charm directed at those who could benefit him and calculated cruelty directed at those who couldn't fight back. Surrounding Tank was a carefully selected group of lieutenants who each brought their own particular skills to the collective effort of maintaining their elevated status. There was Jessica Morales, whose beauty pageant background had taught her how to smile warmly while delivering cutting insults, and whose ability to rally other girls to her cause made her a formidable ally in campaigns of social destruction. Her long, perfectly styled auburn hair and designer clothes marked her as someone from one of the wealthier families in the district, and she used her economic advantages to create an atmosphere where students who couldn't afford the latest fashions or newest technology were automatically relegated to lower social tiers. Then there was Brad Chun, whose academic achievements had earned him membership in multiple honor societies, but whose deep-seated insecurities about his own social standing made him eager to prove his loyalty to Tank through increasingly elaborate displays of cruelty toward easier targets. Brad had discovered that his sharp wit and encyclopedic knowledge of other students' embarrassing moments made him valuable as the group's primary intelligence gatherer and character assassin. He could recall with photographic precision every social misstep, academic failure, or family scandal that might be weaponized against someone who had earned the group's displeasure. Finally, there was Devin Martinez, a junior whose smaller stature and baby-faced appearance disguised a mean streak that ran deeper than anyone in the group except possibly Tank himself. Devin had learned to compensate for his physical limitations by becoming exceptionally skilled at identifying and exploiting other people's emotional vulnerabilities. He could sense insecurity the way predators sense weakness, and he took genuine pleasure in the systematic dismantling of his victims' self-esteem through carefully orchestrated campaigns of harassment that were designed to appear almost accidental to casual observers. This group had operated with virtual impunity for nearly 2 years, in part because they were careful to target students who were unlikely to fight back effectively, and in part because they had cultivated relationships with key faculty members who saw them as positive influences in the school community. Tank's status as a star athlete made him virtually untouchable. Jessica's family connections ensured that any complaints about her behavior were handled with minimal consequences, and Brad's academic achievements provided him with protection from teachers who valued high test scores over character development. Their methods were sophisticated and evolved constantly to stay ahead of administrative attempts to address bullying. Rather than engaging in obvious physical violence that might trigger official responses, they specialized in psychological warfare that was difficult to document and even more difficult to punish. They would orchestrate situations where their targets would be publicly humiliated in ways that appeared to be coincidental, would spread rumors through social media platforms that school officials couldn't monitor effectively, and would create social environments where their victims felt isolated and helpless without any single incident being serious enough to warrant disciplinary action. The group's success had made them increasingly bold in their choice of targets, and their confidence in their own invulnerability had grown to the point where they began to believe that no one at Lincoln Technical High School was beyond their reach. They had systematically worked their way through the most obvious victims, the students who were visibly different, obviously vulnerable, or socially isolated in ways that made them easy prey. But as their sophomore and junior year targets graduated or transferred to other schools, Tank and his crew began casting their nets wider, looking for new sources of entertainment and new ways to demonstrate their power. It was during this period of expansion that Keiko Nakamura first appeared on their radar, though initially she seemed like such an unremarkable target that they almost dismissed her entirely. Her habit of avoiding social situations meant that she had never provided them with obvious ammunition. Her academic performance was solid, but not exceptional enough to trigger Brad's competitive instincts, and her general invisibility made her seem like hardly worth the effort required for a proper campaign of harassment. But Tank had developed an instinct for sensing potential in unlikely places, and something about Keiko's deliberate self-effacement struck him as a challenge rather than a deterrent. He began to notice the way she moved through crowded hallways without ever seeming hurried or flustered, the way she managed to complete group projects without ever seeming to assert herself, but somehow always producing work that met the teacher's expectations, and the way she seemed completely unbothered by the social dynamics that consumed most of their classmates' attention and energy. This quality of unflappability began to irritate Tank in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He was accustomed to reading people's weaknesses within the first few minutes of interaction, to identifying the specific fears or insecurities that could be exploited to establish dominance. But Keiko presented him with a puzzle that his usual analytical tools couldn't solve, and her apparent immunity to the social pressures that affected everyone else began to feel like a personal affront to his authority. The decision to target Keiko wasn't made in a single moment, but evolved gradually through a series of observations and conversations among the group members. Jessica complained that Keiko's handmade lunches and modest clothing made other students feel bad about their own family situations, suggesting that her very presence was somehow judgmental. Brad noted that she never participated in classroom discussions in ways that might help or hinder other students' academic performance, implying that her neutrality was actually a form of selfishness. Devin observed that she never seemed to react to social cues or seek approval from her peers, characterizing this independence as evidence of an superiority complex that needed to be addressed. By the beginning of the spring semester, Tank had convinced himself that Keiko represented exactly the kind of quiet arrogance that his group existed to correct. Her refusal to acknowledge their social authority, her apparent indifference to the hierarchies that governed everyone else's behavior, and her seeming contentment with her own company all struck him as challenges that demanded responses. He began to develop plans for bringing her into line with the social order that he and his friends had worked so hard to establish and maintain. The campaign against Keiko began with the kind of subtle psychological warfare that Tank's group had perfected over their years of collaboration. It started on a Tuesday morning in late February, when the winter air still carried the bite of frost, and students hurried through the hallways wrapped in heavy coats and scarves. Keiko was at her locker, methodically organizing her books for the morning classes, when Jessica approached with the practiced smile of someone who had learned to weaponize false friendliness. "Oh my God, Keiko, right?" Jessica said, her voice pitched at exactly the right volume to carry to nearby students, without seeming like she was performing for an audience. I've been meaning to ask you about that lunch you bring every day. It's so authentic. Do you make it yourself, or does your grandmother pack it for you like you're still in elementary school?" The question was crafted with surgical precision to accomplish multiple goals simultaneously. On the surface, it appeared to be a genuine inquiry about cultural food traditions, the kind of conversation that teachers and administrators encouraged as part of building cross-cultural understanding. But underneath the polite veneer, it carried implications about Keiko's maturity level, her family's economic situation, and her foreignness that were designed to make her feel self-conscious and isolated. Keiko looked up from her locker, meeting Jessica's gaze with the same calm expression she wore during her morning meditation sessions. "My grandmother prepares it," she said simply, offering no additional information or emotional reaction that might provide Jessica with material for further manipulation. The response clearly frustrated Jessica, who had expected either defensive explanations that could be twisted into further embarrassment or apologetic behavior that would signal vulnerability. Instead, Keiko simply returned to organizing her books, treating the interaction as if it were a routine exchange of information rather than the opening move in a psychological chess game. Over the following weeks, the attacks escalated in both frequency and sophistication. Brad began making seemingly innocent comments about academic performance that were designed to undermine Keiko's confidence in her intellectual abilities. During group discussions in their shared advanced placement chemistry class, he would interrupt her rare contributions with corrections that were technically accurate, but delivered in a tone that implied she had made fundamental errors in understanding. "Actually, Keiko," he would say with exaggerated patience, "the molecular structure you're describing would be thermodynamically unstable under normal atmospheric conditions. Maybe you're thinking of a different compound." The corrections were often unnecessary, addressing minor points of terminology rather than substantive errors, but they served their intended purpose of making Keiko appear less knowledgeable than she actually was and discouraging her from participating in future discussions. Devon's contributions to the campaign were more directly personal and invasive. He had developed an extensive network of informants throughout the school who provided him with detailed intelligence about students' family situations, social relationships, and personal vulnerabilities. Through this network, he had learned about the tragic death of Keiko's parents and her grandmother's multiple jobs to support their household. Armed with this information, he began making casual references to financial hardship and family tragedy that were carefully disguised as expressions of sympathy. "It must be really hard for your grandmother, working so many hours to take care of you," he would say when Keiko was within earshot, his voice filled with fake concern. "I can't imagine how exhausting it must be for someone her age to handle all that responsibility. My mom was just saying how grateful we should be for stable family situations." The comments were designed to make Keiko feel like a burden on her grandmother and to highlight the economic disparities between her situation and those of her more privileged classmates. The psychological pressure was applied consistently but subtly, creating an atmosphere where Keiko found herself anticipating negative interactions whenever she encountered members of Tank's group. They had learned to time their comments and actions for maximum impact, striking when she was already stressed about upcoming exams, or when she was carrying heavy loads of books that made it difficult for her to maneuver quickly through crowded hallways. Tank himself remained largely in the background during these initial phases, observing Keiko's reactions and looking for signs that the cumulative stress was beginning to affect her composure. He was searching for the specific triggers that would provoke a strong emotional response, the particular vulnerabilities that could be exploited to force her into behavior that would justify more direct intervention. But to his growing frustration, Keiko continued to respond to each incident with the same unflappable calm that originally attracted his attention. Her grandmother had taught her to recognize these patterns of behavior as tests of character rather than genuine threats, and Her years of martial arts training had instilled in her a deep understanding of how emotional reactions could be manipulated and exploited. She treated each encounter with Tank's group as she would treat a sparring session in the dojo, maintaining her center of balance both physically and mentally while carefully observing her opponent's techniques and intentions. The escalation to KOF. More overt forms of harassment began in early March when Tank decided that subtle, psychological manipulation was insufficient to achieve his goals. The first incident involved her gym uniform, which disappeared from her locker during her physical education class and was later discovered in one of the bathroom trash cans, soaked in what appeared to be coffee but might have been deliberately applied to create the appearance of an accident. When Keiko reported the incident to Coach Williams, she was told that students were responsible for securing their own belongings and that the school couldn't be held liable for items that went missing due to carelessness. The coach's response reflected a broader institutional attitude that treated such incidents as unfortunate but inevitable parts of the high school experience rather than deliberate acts of harassment that required investigation and consequences. Pattern continued with increasing frequency and boldness. Keiko's textbooks would disappear from her desk during classes, only to be found later in locations that suggested they had been deliberately hidden rather than accidentally misplaced. Her homework assignments would vanish from her backpack between classes, forcing her to explain to teachers why she couldn't turn in work that she had completed but could no longer locate. Her locker combination would mysteriously stop working, requiring trips to the administrative office to have it reset while she missed portions of her classes. Each incident was individually minor enough to be dismissed as coincidence or carelessness, but collectively they created a pattern of disruption that made it increasingly difficult for Keiko to maintain her academic performance and daily routines. The perpetrators were careful to ensure that no single incident was serious enough to trigger serious disciplinary action, and they had learned to create plausible alternative explanations for each occurrence that made it virtually impossible for school officials to identify intentional harassment. Tank's group had also begun recruiting additional participants from among the broader student body, using a combination of social pressure and promised rewards to convince other students to participate in the harassment campaign. They presented the targeting of Keiko as a form of entertainment rather than cruelty, suggesting that her lack of emotional response indicated that she wasn't really being hurt by their actions, and that anyone who objected was taking things too seriously. This expansion of the harassment network created an environment where Keiko found herself under constant surveillance and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Students she had never spoken to would bump into her in hallways, knock books from her hands, or make comments about her appearance and behavior that seemed to come from nowhere but were actually coordinated parts of the larger campaign against her. The psychological impact of this systematic harassment was exactly what Tank had hoped to achieve. Even someone with Keiko's extensive mental training began to feel the cumulative stress of never knowing when the next incident would occur or what form it might take. She found herself becoming more vigilant and defensive in her movements through the school, constantly scanning for potential threats and preparing for confrontations that might emerge without warning. But what Tank and his collaborators failed to understand was that their campaign of harassment was not breaking down Keiko's resistance so much as it was crystallizing her resolve and forcing her to confront fundamental questions about the appropriate use of the skills her grandmother had taught her. In the quiet sanctuary of their small apartment above Sakura Market, where the scents of miso soup and steamed rice created an atmosphere of warmth that contrasted sharply with the harsh fluorescent lighting of Lincoln Technical High School, Keiko carried secrets that would have fundamentally altered how her classmates perceived her. The apartment itself was modest, with tatami mats covering portions of the hardwood floors and traditional Japanese artwork hanging alongside family photographs that chronicled 3 generations of the Nakamura family's journey from Kyoto to Tokyo. This working-class neighborhood in the American Midwest every morning at 5:15. While her classmates slept soundly in beds warmed by central heating systems their families could afford without consideration, Keiko would rise in darkness and make her way to the basement that her grandmother had transformed into something approaching a traditional dojo. The space measured barely 12 feet by 16 feet, but Hiromi had arranged it with the kind of attention to detail that reflected decades of experience in authentic martial arts instruction. Proper judo mats covered the concrete floor, creating a surface that could absorb the impact of throws and falls without causing injury. A small shrine occupied one corner, honoring the lineage of masters who had passed down the techniques and philosophy that Hiromi now shared with her granddaughter. The walls were lined with certificates and photographs that told the story of Hiromi's own journey through the ranks of competitive judo. There were pictures of her as a teenager in pristine white gi, executing throws against opponents who often towered over her diminutive frame. Championship medals hung in neat rows, their gold and silver surfaces tarnished by age but still gleaming with the pride of achievement earned through years of disciplined training. Most remarkable of all was a framed letter written in formal Japanese calligraphy, commending Hiromi for her technical excellence and inviting her to train with the national team in preparation for international competition. But it was the more recent photographs that revealed the true depth of Keiko's hidden abilities. Images from tournaments held throughout the region showed her in various stages of executing techniques that demonstrated not just competence, but genuine mastery. In one photograph, she was captured mid-throw, her body positioned with the perfect balance and timing that separated elite practitioners from mere recreational students. Her opponent, a girl nearly 6 inches taller and significantly heavier, was suspended horizontally in the air, completely under Keiko's control despite the apparent mismatch in physical dimensions that the tournament records spoke even more eloquently than the photographs. Keiko had begun competing in junior divisions at age 12, initially struggling against opponents who had advantages in size, strength, and experience. But under her grandmother's patient guidance, she had developed a style that maximized her natural speed and flexibility while minimizing the importance of raw physical power. By 14, she was regularly defeating competitors in higher age and weight categories, earning recognition from judges and fellow competitors who understood the technical sophistication required to overcome such disadvantages. Her breakthrough had come during the regional youth championships 2 years earlier, when she faced Melissa Thompson, a 16-year-old from a prestigious martial arts academy, whose aggressive style and imposing physical presence had intimidated most of her previous opponents. Thompson outweighed Keiko by nearly 30 pounds and had earned her black belt through a commercial program that emphasized power and intimidation over technical precision. The match had begun with Thompson attempting to use her size advantage to overwhelm Keiko through sheer force, grabbing and pushing with the kind of crude technique that often succeeded against less skilled opponents. But Keiko had responded with a demonstration of classical judo that left spectators and judges struggling to process what they had witnessed. Using a combination of footwork, timing, and leverage that seemed to defy physics, she had redirected Thompson's aggressive attacks into a series of throws that culminated in a perfect so-inage that lifted the larger girl completely off her feet and deposited her on the mat with such control that the impact was firm but not harmful. The entire sequence had lasted less than 15 seconds, but it represented years of training and a level of technical understanding that most practitioners spent decades trying to achieve. The victory had earned Keiko recognition throughout the regional judo community, with invitations to train at elite academies and opportunities to compete at national-level tournaments. But her grandmother had counseled patience and humility, emphasizing that true mastery came not from seeking recognition but from continuous improvement and the cultivation of character. They had continued training together in their basement dojo, focusing on refinement of technique and the development of the mental discipline that distinguished authentic martial artists from mere athletic competitors. Hiromi's approach to instruction reflected traditional Japanese teaching methods that emphasized repetition, attention to detail, and the gradual development of understanding through direct experience rather than theoretical explanation. Each morning's training session began with meditation and breathing exercises, designed to cultivate the mental clarity and emotional stability that were essential for effective technique execution. Keiko would spend 20 minutes in seiza, the formal kneeling position, focusing her attention on her breathing while her grandmother prepared the training space and reviewed the technical elements they would practice that day. The physical training itself was structured around the systematic development of fundamental skills that would later be combined into more complex applications. They would begin with yukimi, the art of falling safely, practicing rolls and breakfalls until Keiko's body responded automatically to any loss of balance. This foundation was crucial not just for safety during training, but for the development of the spatial awareness and body control that allowed advanced practitioners to recover from disadvantageous positions and turn defensive situations into offensive opportunities. From yukimi, they would progress through the basic categories of judo technique, nage vaza, the throw-in techniques that formed the art's most visible and dramatic elements, katami vaza, the grappling techniques used for controlling and submitting opponents on the ground, and atemi vaza, the striking techniques that were less emphasized in modern sport judo, but remained part of the complete martial system. Each category contained dozens of individual techniques, and each technique required months or years of practice to execute with the kind of effortless precision that characterized her mastery. But perhaps the most important aspect of Keiko's training was the cultivation of zanshin, the mental state of relaxed alertness that allowed practitioners to respond instantaneously to changing circumstances without conscious thought or emotional interference. Hiromi had taught her that physical techniques, no matter how perfectly executed, were only tools that served the deeper purpose of developing character and wisdom. The real test of martial arts training was not what happened on the competition mat, but how practitioners conducted themselves in daily life when faced with conflict, pressure, and the temptation to use their abilities inappropriately. This philosophical foundation was what allowed Keiko to maintain her composure during the escalating harassment at Lincoln Technical High School. Her grandmother had prepared her not just to defend herself physically, but to recognize the difference between situations that required action and those that could be resolved through patience and strategic non-engagement. Every encounter with Tank's group became an opportunity to practice the mental disciplines she had learned in the dojo, to test her ability to remain centered and clear-thinking under pressure. The irony was profound and would have been amusing under different circumstances. Tank and his collaborators were directing their attacks against someone whose technical abilities and competitive achievements far exceeded anything they had accomplished in their own athletic pursuits. Keiko had faced opponents who were faster, stronger, and more experienced than any of her high school tormentors, and she had prevailed through superior technique, better conditioning, and mental toughness that had been forged through years of demanding training. But her grandmother's teachings had also instilled in her a deep respect for the responsibility that came with such abilities, and the understanding that true strength was demonstrated through restraint rather than aggression. The wisdom that guided Keiko through her darkest moments at Lincoln Technical High School came not from self-help books or guidance counselors, but from the weathered hands and patient voice of her grandmother, who had learned life's most important lessons through decades of struggle, loss, and quiet perseverance. Hiromi Nakamura possessed the kind of deep understanding that could only be earned through experiencing both triumph and tragedy, success and failure, the heights of recognition and the depths of starting over in a foreign country with nothing but determination and unshakable principles. Every evening after Keiko returned from school, when the weight of accumulated harassment made her shoulders tense and her jaw clench with suppressed frustration. Hiromi would prepare tea in the traditional manner and create space for conversations that went far beyond the immediate problems her granddaughter faced. These discussions took place in their small living room, where the soft light from paper lanterns created an atmosphere of tranquility that seemed to exist in a different universe from the harsh fluorescent corridors of the high school. Mago, Hiromi would say, using the affectionate term for granddaughter while settling onto the cushions arranged around their low wooden table. Tell me what troubles your spirit today. The invitation was always gentle but persistent, accompanied by the ritual of serving tea that provided natural pauses for reflection and the careful selection of words Hiromi had learned during her own difficult years of adjustment to American culture that healing often began with the simple act of being heard without judgment or immediate advice. During one particularly difficult conversation in late March, when the harassment campaign had intensified to the point where Keiko was beginning to dread each school day, she finally allowed some of her carefully controlled emotions to surface. "They treat me like I'm nothing, Baba," she said, using the childhood nickname that still felt natural despite her 17 years. "Like I don't deserve basic respect or the right to exist in the same space as them. Sometimes I wonder if they're right, if there's something fundamentally wrong with me that makes me a target." Hiromi set down her teacup with the deliberate precision that characterized all her movements, her dark eyes studying her granddaughter's face with the intensity of someone who understood that this moment required wisdom rather than mere comfort. "When I was your age," she began, her voice carrying the weight of memories that spanned continents and decades, "Japan was rebuilding itself after the war, and young women who practiced martial arts were considered strange and inappropriate. Society had very clear ideas about what girls should do and be, and my choice to pursue judo was seen as rebellion against natural order." She paused to sip her tea, allowing the silence to create space for the deeper meaning of her words to settle. "My own parents supported my training, but the community around us often made their disapproval known through whispers, exclusion, and the kind of subtle cruelty that leaves no visible wounds but damages the spirit. I remember wondering, as you wonder now, whether it would be easier to simply conform to their expectations and abandon the path that brought me joy and strength." The conversation continued as Hiromi shared stories from her youth that Keiko had heard in fragments but never as part of a complete narrative about resilience and identity. She spoke of tournaments where she was the only female competitor, facing not just the technical challenges of her opponents, but the psychological pressure of proving that she belonged in spaces where her presence was considered inappropriate. She described the frustration of having her victories dismissed as flukes or attributed to luck rather than skill, and the way some judges seemed to look for reasons to penalize her techniques that would have been celebrated if performed by male competitors. "But the most important lesson I learned," Hiromi continued, reaching across the table to take her granddaughter's hands in her own, "was that other people's inability to see your worth says nothing about your actual value. Their blindness is their limitation, not yours. When someone treats you as if you are less than you are, they reveal the poverty of their own understanding, not any deficiency in your character or abilities." These philosophical discussions were always accompanied by practical guidance that drew on Hiromi's deep understanding of human psychology and conflict dynamics. She had observed during her decades of martial arts training that the students who progressed most rapidly were those who could maintain their emotional equilibrium under pressure, who could think clearly when others became reactive, and who understood that every confrontation contained opportunities for learning and growth. "The hardest part of mastering judo," she explained during another evening conversation, "is not learning to throw or pin an opponent. Those are just physical skills that improve with practice. The real challenge is developing the wisdom to know when to engage and when to redirect, when to apply force and when to yield, when to stand firm and when to move like water around obstacles that cannot be directly overcome. She helped Keiko understand that her current situation at school was essentially a complex martial arts scenario that required the same principles she had been learning in their basement dojo. The bullies were like aggressive opponents who relied on intimidation and crude tactics, but who often revealed exploitable weaknesses through their very aggression. Tank's group was making the classic mistake of underestimating their target, while overestimating their own capabilities, creating conditions that could be turned to Keiko's advantage if she maintained her composure and waited for the right opportunity. "Remember the story of the willow tree and the oak," Hiromi said, referencing a parable she had shared many times, but which took on new relevance in their current circumstances. "The mighty oak stands rigid and proud, showing its strength to all who pass beneath its branches. But when the great storm comes, the oak's rigidity becomes its weakness. It cannot bend, cannot adapt, and so it breaks and falls. The humble willow, meanwhile, bends with the wind, appears to be defeated, but ultimately survives because it understands that true strength sometimes requires the appearance of weakness." This metaphor became a guiding principle for how Keiko approached each day at Lincoln Technical High School. Instead of viewing her restraint as weakness or failure, she began to see it as strategic patience, a form of active engagement that required tremendous discipline and self-control. She was not simply enduring the harassment passively, but was actively choosing her responses based on a deeper understanding of timing, consequence, and the ultimate goals she hoped to achieve. Hiromi also helped her granddaughter understand the psychological dynamics that drove people like Tank and his group to seek targets for their aggression. "Bullies are usually people who feel powerless in some important area of their lives," she explained. "They attack others not from a position of genuine strength, but from insecurity and fear. When someone needs to make others feel small in order to feel big themselves, they reveal that they do not truly believe in their own worth or capabilities." This insight allowed Keiko to view her tormentors with something approaching compassion rather than hatred, though it did not diminish her readiness to defend herself if the situation escalated beyond psychological warfare. She began to recognize patterns in their behavior that suggested they were as trapped by their own roles as she was affected by their attacks. Tank's constant need to prove his dominance, Jessica's reliance on social manipulation to maintain her status, Brad's use of intellectual superiority to mask his emotional insecurities, and Devon's cruelty as compensation for his own vulnerability. "But compassion does not mean allowing others to harm you," Hiromi was careful to emphasize. "Understanding someone's pain or insecurity does not obligate you to accept their mistreatment. There is a difference between having empathy for people's struggles and enabling their destructive behavior. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for someone is to set clear boundaries about what you will and will not accept." As spring progressed and the harassment continued to escalate, these evening conversations became increasingly focused on preparation for what both Keiko and her grandmother sensed was an inevitable confrontation. The weight of maintaining her carefully constructed facade began pressing down on Keiko's shoulders like an invisible burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Every morning as she prepared for school, she found herself standing longer in front of the bathroom mirror, studying her own reflection and searching for signs that the constant stress was beginning to show in ways that might encourage her tormentors to escalate their campaign. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of nights when sleep came fitfully, interrupted by replaying the day's humiliations and anticipating tomorrow's potential confrontations. Her academic performance, which had always served as both a source of personal pride and a practical necessity for maintaining her scholarship status, began showing subtle but concerning signs of deterioration. The physics homework that had once required 2 focused hours now stretched into 3 or 4 sessions, interrupted by periods of distraction and anxiety. Her normally meticulous notes became scattered and incomplete as she found herself constantly scanning classrooms for potential threats rather than concentrating fully on the material being presented. During advanced placement chemistry, where Brad's calculated interruptions had become a regular feature of group discussions, Keiko noticed herself becoming increasingly reluctant to participate, even when she knew the correct answers to questions posed by Mrs. Henderson. The fear of providing Brad with additional opportunities for public correction and humiliation had begun to override her natural intellectual curiosity and her desire to engage with challenging academic material. She would write detailed responses in her notebook, but keep them to herself, creating a growing disconnect between her internal engagement with learning and her external participation in the educational process. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her situation to endure. Lincoln Technical High School contained nearly 3,000 students, creating countless opportunities for social connection and community building. Yet Keiko found herself increasingly alone in crowds. During lunch periods, she would sit in the library not just because it provided a quiet space for studying, but because it offered protection from the cafeteria environment, where Tank's group could orchestrate public humiliations in front of large audiences who would inevitably become unwilling participants in her degradation. Even teachers who had previously shown appreciation for her consistent performance and respectful classroom behavior began treating her with a kind of benign neglect that suggested they had unconsciously absorbed the social dynamics that positioned her as somehow less worthy of attention and encouragement. Mrs. Patterson, who taught freshman English and had once praised Keiko's thoughtful essay analyses, now seemed to look past her when calling on students for responses. Mr. Williams, her AP history teacher, had stopped asking for her insights during discussions about complex historical events. Despite her demonstrated understanding of the material and her ability to draw connections between past and present circumstances, this institutional indifference created an additional layer of psychological pressure that compounded the direct harassment from Tank's group. Keiko began to question whether her perceptions of the situation were accurate, whether she was somehow overreacting to normal teenage social dynamics, or whether there was something about her behavior that justified the treatment she was receiving. The doubt was corrosive, eating away at the confidence that her grandmother had worked so carefully to cultivate through years of patient instruction and encouragement. Her grandmother's evening conversations provided essential emotional support, but they could not entirely shield Keiko from the cumulative impact of existing in a constant state of defensive vigilance. She found herself analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings and potential threats, exhausting mental energy that should have been available for learning, growth, and the normal processes of adolescent development. Simple activities like walking through hallways or entering classrooms became exercises in tactical assessment rather than routine transitions between educational experiences. The physical manifestations of stress began appearing despite her attempts to maintain her usual routines and disciplines. Her morning meditation sessions, which had always provided a foundation of calm stability for facing the day's challenges, became increasingly difficult to sustain as her mind raced with anticipations of potential confrontations. The muscle tension that accumulated in her neck and shoulders throughout school days began carrying over into her evening training sessions, affecting the fluid grace that had always characterized her judo practice. Her grandmother noticed these changes with the keen observation skills that came from decades of working with students under pressure. During their training sessions, Hiromi began incorporating specific exercises designed to release physical tension and restore mental equilibrium. But she also recognized that the underlying source of stress needed to be addressed rather than simply managed indefinitely. "Mago," she said one evening as they sat together after a particularly challenging training session, "I can see that carrying this burden is becoming more difficult each day. Your spirit is strong, but even the strongest blade can be damaged. if it is constantly striking against stone without purpose or progress. The conversation that followed was different from their previous discussions about patience and strategic restraint. Hiromi began preparing her granddaughter for the possibility that direct action might become necessary, not because she advocated for confrontation, but because she understood that some situations could not be resolved through avoidance and that Keiko needed to be mentally and emotionally ready if circumstances forced her hand. There is a concept in martial arts called sen no sen, Hiromi explained, using the Japanese term that described the timing principle of intercepting an attack at its inception rather than waiting to respond after being struck. It means reading the intention behind an action and responding to the threat before it fully manifests. This is different from being aggressive or starting conflicts, but it requires the wisdom to recognize when peaceful resolution is no longer possible and decisive. Action becomes necessary for protection. These discussions included practical considerations about the potential consequences of any physical confrontation that might occur at school. Hiromi helped Keiko understand that defending herself effectively would likely result in administrative scrutiny, possible suspension, and definitely increased attention from students and faculty who had previously ignored her existence. They talked through scenarios for explaining her actions to school officials, for dealing with potential legal implications, and for managing the social fallout that would inevitably follow any dramatic revelation of her capabilities. But perhaps, most importantly, they discussed the internal landscape that Keiko would need to navigate if forced to use her training in a real-world situation outside the controlled environment of their dojo. Hiromi emphasized that the emotional aftermath of a genuine confrontation could be more challenging than the physical aspects, particularly for someone who had been raised to value peace, restraint, and the careful consideration of consequences before taking action. When that moment comes, if it comes, Hiromi said with the gravity that reflected her own experiences with conflict and its aftermath, you will discover things about yourself that you cannot learn through training alone. You will face the reality of your own power and the responsibility that comes with it. This is not something to fear, but it is something to respect and prepare for mentally as well as physically. The preparation was not just philosophical, but intensely practical. Their evening training sessions began incorporating scenarios that more closely resembled the kinds of confrontations that might occur in school hallways rather than formal tournament settings. They practiced dealing with multiple attackers, confined spaces, and situations where Keiko would need to control the level of force applied to avoid causing serious injury while still protecting herself effectively. The transformation happening within Keiko was subtle but profound. The quiet girl who had once moved through Lincoln Technical High School like a shadow was gradually developing the internal steel that would soon surprise everyone who thought they understood her limitations and capabilities. The morning of April 15th dawned gray and drizzling, with the kind of persistent spring rain that turned the sidewalks around Lincoln Technical High School into reflective mirrors that caught the harsh glare of overhead security lights. Students hurried through the parking lots with their hoods pulled up and backpacks clutched protectively against their chests, creating an atmosphere of general irritation and discomfort that seemed to amplify the underlying tensions that always simmered just beneath the surface of the school's social ecosystem. Keiko arrived at her usual time, 7:45 on the dot, but found herself moving more slowly than normal through the main entrance. Something in the air felt different that morning, charged with the kind of electric potential that preceded thunderstorms. She had learned through her years of martial arts training to trust these intuitive warnings, the subtle signals that her unconscious mind picked up from changes in body language, facial expressions, and the general energy of her environment. Tank and his crew were clustered near the main staircase, their conversation animated in a way that suggested they had been planning something during their weekend communications. Jessica's laughter had the sharp, excited quality that Keiko had learned to associate with the group's more elaborate schemes, while Brad's constant glancing toward the entrance indicated they were waiting for something or someone specific. Devon stood slightly apart from the others, his smaller frame practically vibrating with the nervous energy that often preceded his most cruel initiatives. The first period proceeded normally enough, with Keiko taking her customary seat in the back corner of Mrs. Rodriguez's AP Calculus classroom and focusing on the complex derivatives that covered the whiteboard in neat, methodical progressions. Mathematics had always provided her with a refuge from social complications, a realm where problems had definitive solutions and success was measured by objective criteria rather than subjective social judgments. But even during the quiet concentration of mathematical problem solving, she found herself glancing periodically toward the door and maintaining awareness of the other students' movements and conversations. It was during the transition between second and third periods that the morning's carefully maintained normalcy began to unravel. Keiko had stopped at her locker to exchange her calculus materials for the biology textbook and lab notebook she would need for Dr. Patterson's advanced placement course, when she noticed that the combination lock felt different under her fingers. The mechanism turned smoothly enough, but the subtle resistance patterns that she had memorized through months of daily use seemed to have changed slightly. When she opened the metal door, the source of the difference became immediately apparent. Her carefully organized space had been invaded and rearranged, with books shifted from their usual positions and papers scattered in ways that spoke of hasty searching rather than casual disruption. More disturbing was the discovery of several items that didn't belong to her: a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be marijuana, a flask that smelled strongly of alcohol, and a folded note written in handwriting she didn't recognize that contained explicit and threatening language directed toward several teachers. The planted evidence was sophisticated enough to potentially cause serious problems if discovered by school authorities, but crude enough that someone with Keiko's analytical mind could recognize it as obviously fabricated. The marijuana was too fresh and pungent, suggesting it had been placed recently rather than forgotten over time. The alcohol flask bore fingerprints that were clearly not hers, and the threatening note was written in block letters that showed signs of deliberate disguise rather than natural handwriting patterns. But the most disturbing discovery was what had happened to her school uniform. The regulation blazer that was required for all students during formal school hours had been removed from its hanger and systematically damaged in ways that were clearly intentional. The fabric had been torn along the seams in multiple places, creating rips that would be impossible to conceal and difficult to repair. The school emblem had been deliberately defaced with what appeared to be permanent marker, and the buttons had been cut off and scattered across the bottom of the locker. The destruction of her uniform represented an escalation beyond mere psychological harassment into direct interference with her ability to meet the school's dress code requirements. Lincoln Technical High School enforced its uniform policies strictly, with violations resulting in immediate removal from classes and mandatory conferences with administrators. Students who could not maintain proper dress standards were typically suspended until the problems could be corrected, creating academic penalties that could affect graduation requirements and scholarship eligibility. For Keiko, whose financial situation made replacing the destroyed uniform a significant hardship, the attack represented a calculated attempt to force her out of school through economic pressure rather than direct confrontation. Her grandmother worked multiple part-time jobs to cover their basic expenses, and the cost of purchasing a new blazer would require sacrifices in other areas of their carefully managed budget. The perpetrators had chosen their target with precision, striking at one of the few vulnerabilities that could potentially achieve their goal of making her life at Lincoln Technical High School unsustainable. As she stood staring at the damaged uniform, Keiko became aware that a crowd had begun to gather around her locker. Students were pointing and whispering, some pulling out phones to capture images of the scene, others simply watching with the morbid fascination that accompanied any dramatic disruption of the school's normal routine. The attention felt like physical pressure against her skin, and she could hear fragments of speculation and commentary that ranged from sympathetic to accusatory. "Did you see what happened to her uniform?" one voice asked, though whether the tone implied concern or amusement was difficult to determine. "Maybe she did it herself for attention," suggested another student, demonstrating the kind of victim-blaming logic that often emerged when people couldn't process the reality of systematic harassment. Tank appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd, his expression carefully composed to suggest surprise and concern rather than satisfaction. "Oh wow, Keiko," he said loudly enough to ensure that everyone nearby could hear his words. "That's really terrible. Do you have any idea who might have done something like this? I mean, you must have really upset someone to deserve this kind of treatment." The comment was perfectly crafted to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. On the surface, it appeared to express sympathy for her situation and outrage at the perpetrator's actions. But the underlying message was clear. The destruction of her uniform was presented as a natural consequence of her own behavior rather than an unprovoked attack, and Tank's public speculation about what she might have done to deserve such treatment served to shift blame away from the actual perpetrators and onto the victim herself. Jessica joined the performance with her own carefully rehearsed expressions of shock and concern. "This is just awful," she declared, her voice pitched to carry throughout the hallway. "Keiko, you should definitely report this to the administration right away. I'm sure they'll want to investigate thoroughly, especially when they find all those interesting items in your locker." The reference to the planted contraband was delivered with surgical precision, loud enough to be heard by the growing crowd, but subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability about any direct knowledge of how those items had come to be there. Other students began craning their necks to see what Jessica was referring to, and several phones were repositioned to capture images of the drug paraphernalia and alcohol that had been strategically placed to maximize their visibility. Brad stepped forward with his characteristic air of intellectual authority, analyzing the situation with the same detached precision he brought to academic discussions. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this kind of destruction usually indicates some pretty serious underlying conflicts. I wonder if there might be more to this story than we're seeing on the surface." The psychological pressure was building to unbearable levels as more students gathered, and the speculation grew increasingly elaborate and accusatory. Keiko could feel dozens of eyes studying her reactions, waiting to see whether she would break down emotionally, lash out defensively, or simply accept the humiliation passively as she had done so many times before, but this time felt fundamentally different from all the previous incidents of harassment and provocation. The moment when everything changed arrived not with dramatic music or slow-motion effects, but with the simple sound of fabric tearing that seemed to echo through the crowded hallway like a gunshot. Tank had been reaching into Keiko's locker, ostensibly to help her remove the planted contraband, while ensuring that as many students as possible witnessed the discovery, when his large hands grasped the collar of her spare gym uniform that hung on a hook inside the narrow metal space. "Here, let me help you clean this mess up," he said with exaggerated concern, his voice carrying the false sympathy that had become his signature approach to public harassment. But as he pulled the lightweight fabric toward him, whether through genuine clumsiness or deliberate malice, his grip tightened and the delicate material began to give way under the pressure. The ripping sound was sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the ambient noise of student conversations and locker doors slamming like a blade through silence. The gym uniform, which represented one of the few remaining intact pieces of required school clothing that Keiko possessed, tore along its seam from collar to hem in a single devastating moment that left her holding useless strips of fabric. While Tank stood with the larger portion still clutched in his oversized hands, The crowd around them erupted in a mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and excited chatter as phones emerged from pockets and backpacks with the lightning speed that characterized teenage responses to potentially viral moments. The scene had all the elements that social media algorithms favored: conflict, humiliation, and the kind of dramatic visual that could be shared and reshared across platforms until it took on a life of its own beyond the original context. "Oops," Tank said with theatrical innocence, examining the torn fabric as if genuinely surprised by what had occurred. "Sorry about that, Keiko. I guess the material was already pretty worn out. You probably should have replaced it a long time ago." His words carried the kind of casual cruelty that implied her family's economic circumstances were somehow her own fault, and that the destruction he had just caused was merely the inevitable result of her failure to maintain proper equipment. Jessica stepped closer, her perfectly manicured nails catching the fluorescent light as she gestured toward the ruined uniform. "Oh no, that's so embarrassing," she said with false concern that fooled no one who understood the group's dynamics. "And right in front of everyone, too. I hope you have something else to wear for gym class today, because Coach Martinez is really strict about the dress code requirements." The comment was designed to highlight the practical consequences of the destruction while maintaining the pretense that the entire incident was an unfortunate accident rather than a calculated attack. Other students in the crowd began murmuring among themselves, some expressing genuine sympathy for Keiko's situation, while others seemed more interested in the entertainment value of watching someone else's humiliation unfold in real time. Something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere surrounding the confrontation, something that the perpetrators were too intoxicated by their own sense of power to recognize immediately. Keiko's posture had changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood body language and physical presence. Her shoulders had straightened, her feet had shifted into a more balanced stance, and her breathing had deepened into the controlled rhythm that her grandmother had taught her to use when preparing for decisive action. The transformation was not dramatic or obvious to casual observers, but it represented the moment when years of patient discipline and strategic restraint finally gave way to the recognition that the situation had crossed lines that could not be ignored or endured any longer. The destruction of her property, the public humiliation orchestrated for social media consumption, and the systematic campaign to force her out of school through economic pressure had collectively pushed past the boundaries that even her grandmother's wisdom about patience and strategic thinking could accommodate. "That was my only spare uniform," Keiko said quietly, her voice carrying a quality that made several students in the immediate vicinity stop their conversations and turn their attention toward her. The words were simple and factual, delivered without obvious emotion or dramatic emphasis, but they contained an undertone that suggested something significant was about to happen. Tank, still riding the wave of his apparent success and the excitement generated by the crowd's reaction, failed to recognize the warning signs that should have alerted him to retreat while he still had the opportunity. Instead, he stepped closer to Keiko, using his considerable height advantage to loom over her in the intimidating manner that had proven effective in so many previous encounters. "Well, maybe this will teach you to take better care of your things," he said, his voice loud enough to ensure that everyone in the hallway could hear his words clearly. "Or maybe you should ask your grandmother to buy you better quality clothes that don't fall apart so easily. I'm sure she can afford it with all those jobs she works." The reference to Hiromi and the family's financial struggles represented a crossing of lines that even Tank's previous harassment campaigns had avoided. Personal attacks were one thing, but bringing family members into the conflict and mocking their economic circumstances demonstrated a level of cruelty that went beyond mere bullying into territory that demanded response rather than endurance. Devon, sensing an opportunity to escalate the situation further while Tank held the crowd's attention, reached into Keiko's locker and pulled out her chemistry notebook, The one that contained months of carefully recorded laboratory observations and homework assignments that would be impossible to recreate before the next examination period. "Look at this," he announced, holding the notebook above his head where other students could see it clearly. "She even writes her notes in Japanese sometimes. How are we supposed to know she's not cheating or writing about us behind our backs?" He began flipping through the pages with deliberate carelessness, allowing several loose papers to fall to the floor where they were immediately stepped on by students, trying to position themselves for better views of the unfolding drama. Brad joined the performance by pulling out his own phone and positioning it to capture video of the scene. "This is definitely going to be interesting to show people," he said with the kind of academic detachment that made his cruelty seem even more calculated and cold. "I wonder what the administration will think about students who can't even keep their lockers organized properly. Maybe they'll want to investigate whether she's really qualified to be here on scholarship." The threat was clear and specific. The group was prepared to use the evening's destruction and the planted contraband as evidence to support formal complaints that could jeopardize Keiko's academic standing and financial aid eligibility. They had escalated beyond mere social harassment into actions that could have lasting consequences for her educational opportunities and future prospects. The crowd had grown to include nearly 50 students, creating a human amphitheater around the lockers where the confrontation was taking place. The attention was intoxicating for Tank and his collaborators, who fed off the energy generated by public performance and the sense that they were the central figures in a drama that everyone would be discussing for weeks to come. But they had fundamentally miscalculated both the situation and their target. The quiet girl who had endured months of escalating harassment with apparent passivity was not the helpless victim they had assumed her to be. And the moment when she finally decided that strategic restraint was no longer appropriate was about to arrive with the kind of swift inevitability that characterized all truly decisive moments. The transformation began in her eyes, which shifted from the downcast gaze that had become her default expression to direct, unwavering contact that made Tank take an involuntary step backward. Despite his conscious intention to maintain his position of dominance, the silence that preceded Keiko's transformation was the kind of profound stillness that occurs in nature just before lightning strikes, when the air itself seems to hold its breath in anticipation of the release of accumulated energy. For a moment that stretched longer than the actual seconds it occupied, the crowded hallway became suspended in time as something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere surrounding the confrontation. "Stop," Keiko said, and though her voice was quiet, it carried with absolute clarity to every person in the surrounding crowd. The single word contained layers of meaning that went far beyond its simple surface. It was simultaneously a request, a warning, and a declaration that the previous dynamic of victim and aggressor was about to change irrevocably. Tank, still intoxicated by the success of his performance and the energy generated by the audience of his peers, failed to recognize the significance of what was happening. Instead of heeding the subtle but unmistakable warning contained in Keiko's posture and tone, he chose to interpret her response as a sign of weakness, a final desperate attempt to avoid further humiliation through verbal pleading. "Stop what?" he asked with exaggerated confusion, playing to the crowd that surrounded them like a comedian working a particularly responsive audience. "Stop helping you clean up this mess you made. Stop trying to figure out why you're hiding drugs and alcohol in your locker. Stop wondering why you can't seem to take care of your own property." Each question was delivered with increasing volume and theatrical emphasis, designed to maximize the entertainment value of the confrontation while simultaneously reinforcing the narrative that Keiko was responsible for her own predicament. The performance was polished and effective, drawing laughter and commentary from students who were caught up in the excitement of witnessing what appeared to be the climactic moment of a long-running social drama. But as Tank continued his verbal assault, something remarkable began happening too. Keiko's physical presence that was visible to anyone who understood how to read the subtle signs of controlled power. Her breathing shifted from the shallow, rapid pattern of stress and anxiety to the deep, measured rhythm that her grandmother had taught her to use when preparing for serious physical engagement. Her weight settled more evenly onto both feet, creating the kind of stable foundation that could support rapid movement in any direction. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists of frustration and helplessness, relaxed into the loose, ready position that characterized practitioners who no longer needed conscious thought to access their technical skills. "I'm asking you nicely," Keiko continued, her voice maintaining the same quiet intensity that had characterized her first warning. "Don't touch my things anymore. Don't damage my property. Don't involve my family in your games. Just leave me alone." The request was stated with such simple directness that it created a moment of cognitive dissonance for the students, who had grown accustomed to viewing Keiko as someone who accepted mistreatment passively. There was something different about her delivery, a quality of centered authority that suggested she was no longer speaking from a position of powerlessness, but from a place of controlled strength that was choosing restraint over action. Jessica, sensing that the dynamics of the situation were beginning to shift in ways that might not favor their group's agenda, stepped forward to reassert their collective dominance through her own brand of psychological manipulation. "Oh, please," she said with the kind of dismissive laughter that was designed to minimize Keiko's words and restore the previous power balance. "You think you can just give orders now? After hiding drugs in your locker and letting your uniform fall apart because your family can't afford decent clothes?" The attack was multi-layered and sophisticated, combining personal insults about economic circumstances with implications about criminal behavior and character defects. It represented the kind of comprehensive assault on dignity and reputation that had proven effective in breaking down other targets' resistance and forcing them into positions of social submission. Devon, emboldened by Jessica's support and eager to contribute his own cruel insights to the performance, held up Keiko's chemistry notebook and began reading aloud from pages that contained her personal observations and study notes. "Listen to this," he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the mock-serious tone of someone delivering a dramatic reading. "She writes about finding inner balance and maintaining discipline under pressure. What kind of weird stuff is this? Are these like meditation notes or something?" The violation of privacy represented by reading her personal writings aloud was profound and deliberate, designed to expose aspects of her inner life that she had never intended to share with her classmates. The notebook contained not just academic material, but reflections on her training, thoughts about her grandmother's teachings, and personal observations about the challenges of maintaining her identity in an environment that seemed determined to diminish her sense of self-worth. Brad moved closer to examine the notebook over Devon's shoulder, his expression shifting to one of academic interest as he recognized elements that didn't fit his preconceptions about Keiko's capabilities and background. "Wait," he said with growing excitement. "Some of these notes are about martial arts techniques. Look at these diagrams and Japanese terms. She's been studying fighting methods." The discovery sent a ripple of surprise and speculation through the crowd as students began to reassess their understanding of the quiet girl who had seemed so helpless during months of systematic harassment. Phones were repositioned to capture clearer images of the notebook pages, and conversations erupted as people tried to process this unexpected revelation about someone they thought they knew completely. Tank, feeling his control of the situation beginning to slip as attention shifted toward information that cast Keiko in a different light, decided to reassert his dominance through more direct physical intimidation. He stepped closer to her, using his considerable height and weight advantages to create a sense of threat that had proven effective in countless previous encounters with students who lacked the confidence or ability to resist his pressure. "So, you think you're some kind of fighter now?" he asked, his voice dropping to a lower register that was intended to sound menacing rather than theatrical. You think learning a few moves from your grandmother makes you tough enough to stand up to me? Maybe it's time someone taught you the difference between fantasy and reality. The threat was explicit and unmistakable, crossing the line from psychological harassment into the promise of physical violence that transformed the entire situation. From cruel entertainment into a genuine confrontation with potentially serious consequences. The crowd around them sensed the escalation and began repositioning themselves to maintain clear views, while staying out of range of any physical altercation that might develop. What happened next occurred with the kind of fluid grace that made it appear almost choreographed, though it was actually the result of years of disciplined training and thousands of hours of practice that had ingrained proper technique so deeply into Keiko's muscle memory that conscious thought was no longer required for execution. Tank reached out with his right hand to grab her shoulder in the aggressive manner that had intimidated so many previous targets. But instead of finding the expected resistance or submission, his hand encountered empty air as Keiko moved with liquid smoothness to redirect his energy and momentum. The movement was called tsubaki in Japanese martial arts terminology, meaning body movement or body management, and it represented one of the most fundamental skills that separated genuine practitioners from mere recreational students. Keiko's entire body shifted position with perfect timing, rotating just enough to allow Tank's grab to pass harmlessly by while simultaneously positioning herself for whatever response might become necessary. Tank's momentum carried him forward into the space where Keiko had been standing, forcing him to take an additional step to maintain his balance. The failed grab left him temporarily off balance and exposed, though he recovered quickly enough that most observers didn't immediately recognize the significance of what had occurred. "What the hell?" he muttered, turning to face her with an expression that combined confusion, embarrassment, and growing anger. The failure of his intimidation attempt in front of such a large audience represented a challenge to his social status that could not be ignored or dismissed without serious consequences for his reputation and authority. Devon, perhaps sensing that the situation was escalating beyond their usual pattern of psychological manipulation, attempted to restore the previous dynamic through verbal provocation. "Did you see that?" he called out to the crowd, his voice pitched to suggest that Keiko's evasive movement was somehow evidence of cowardice rather than skill. "She's running away before anything even happened. I guess all that martial arts stuff is just for show." But Jessica had been watching more carefully than her companions, and her expression suggested that she was beginning to recognize aspects of the situation that the others were missing. During her years of social manipulation and psychological warfare, she had developed sharp instincts for reading body language and recognizing when power dynamics were shifting in unexpected directions. "Tank," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of warning that was intended for his ears alone. "Maybe we should just walk away now. This doesn't feel right." Her concern was well-founded, but came too late to prevent the momentum of events that Tank's pride and public reputation had set in motion. He had invested too much of his social capital in the confrontation to retreat without achieving some kind of victory that would restore his damaged credibility with the watching students. "Nobody walks away from me," he declared loudly, ensuring that everyone in the hallway could hear his commitment to seeing the confrontation through to its conclusion. Especially not some little girl who thinks she learned how to fight from her grandmother. With those words, Tank committed himself to a course of action that would reveal just how badly he had misjudged both the situation and his opponent. Attack came with all the subtlety and precision of a freight train attempting to perform surgery. Tank's massive frame lurching forward with the kind of crude aggression that relied entirely on size and intimidation rather than actual technique or strategy. His hands reached out in a grabbing motion, that was designed to seize Keiko by the shoulders and use his overwhelming physical advantages to demonstrate his dominance in the most direct and humiliating way possible. The movement was telegraphed so obviously that anyone with even basic training in combat sports would have recognized the opening it created. But Tank's experience had been limited to intimidating opponents who lacked both the skill and confidence. To exploit such fundamental tactical errors, what followed was a masterclass in applied physics and martial arts technique that unfolded with such fluid grace that many of the watching students struggled to process what they were witnessing in real time. Keiko's response began with a subtle shift in her positioning that placed her at an angle to Tank's direct approach, a movement so small and natural that it appeared almost accidental to observers who didn't understand the geometric principles underlying effective defensive positioning. Her feet moved in the pattern known as taisabaki, the body management technique that allowed her to redirect incoming force rather than attempting to meet it head-on with strength that she obviously didn't possess. As Tank's hands reached the space where her shoulders should have been, Keiko executed a technique that her grandmother had taught her during their very first lessons together, a basic but devastatingly effective throw called yuki-goshi that utilized leverage and timing to overcome advantages in size and strength. Her right arm slipped under Tank's extended arm, while her left hand gripped his shirt at the shoulder, creating control points that allowed her to manipulate his balance and momentum. At the same moment, she stepped in close to his body and lowered her center of gravity, positioning her hip as a fulcrum point that would soon become the pivot around which Tank's entire world would literally revolve. The throw itself was executed with the kind of technical precision that spoke to years of dedicated practice and refinement. Keiko's hip made contact with Tank's midsection just as she pulled with her hands and lifted with her legs, creating a combination of forces that lifted his considerable bulk completely off the ground, despite the apparent impossibility of someone her size generating enough power to move someone his mass. The movement was smooth and controlled, with none of the jerky, uncertain quality that characterized techniques performed by beginners or recreational practitioners. Tank's feet left the floor with shocking suddenness, his body rotating around Keiko's hip in a perfect arc that demonstrated the fundamental principle of judo, using an opponent's force and momentum against them rather than opposing strength with strength. For a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than its actual duration, his body was completely airborne and under Keiko's absolute control, suspended horizontally above the hallway floor while dozens of phone cameras captured every angle of his helpless rotation. The impact when Tank struck the polished linoleum was solid and decisive without being unnecessarily violent or dangerous. Keiko had controlled the throw precisely, ensuring that he landed on his back rather than his head or neck, and that the force was sufficient to demonstrate her complete technical superiority without causing serious injury. The sound of his body hitting the floor echoed through the hallway like a judge's gavel, marking the end of one phase of the confrontation and the beginning of something entirely different. The silence that followed was profound and absolute, broken only by the subtle electronic sounds of multiple phones recording what had just occurred. 50 students stood frozen in positions of shock and disbelief, their minds struggling to process the complete reversal of everything they thought they understood about the quiet girl, who had just demonstrated capabilities that seemed to exist in a completely different universe from their previous perceptions of her abilities and character. Tank lay on the floor for several seconds, his eyes wide with confusion and his breathing rapid as his nervous system attempted to process what had happened to him. The fall had not injured him seriously, but it had shattered his understanding of the situation so completely that he seemed unable to formulate any immediate response. His usual confidence and aggressive posture had been replaced by something approaching genuine fear as he realized that he had grossly miscalculated both the nature of his opponent and the likely consequences of his actions. Devon, who had been standing close enough to witness every detail of the throw, stepped backward involuntarily as his mind made connections between what he had just seen and the martial arts diagrams he had been mocking in Keiko's notebook only minutes earlier. His face had gone pale, and his usual cruel smirk had been replaced by an expression of dawning comprehension that suggested he was beginning to understand just how badly their group had misjudged their target. "Holy shit," someone whispered from the crowd, and the comment seemed to break the spell that had held everyone in stunned silence. Conversations erupted throughout the hallway as students began trying to describe what they had witnessed to friends who hadn't been present, though many of them struggled to find words adequate to capture the technical brilliance and complete dominance that Keiko had demonstrated. Jessica, whose social radar had been calibrated through years of reading power dynamics and status hierarchies, immediately recognized that the entire foundation of their group's authority had just been undermined in the most public and humiliating way possible. Tank's reputation as an intimidating force who could control weaker students through physical presence had been destroyed so thoroughly that recovery might be impossible, and her own status as his primary ally made her vulnerable to the same kind of dramatic downfall. But Tank himself was not finished, though his next actions would demonstrate that he had learned nothing from his first encounter with Keiko's actual capabilities. Pride and public humiliation combined with genuine shock to override whatever rational thought processes might have counseled retreat and damage control. Instead of acknowledging his mistake and withdrawing from the confrontation, he rolled over and pushed himself back to his feet with movements that spoke of determination to restore his damaged reputation through continued aggression. "You got lucky," he said loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear, though his voice carried undertones of uncertainty that hadn't been present before his introduction to the hallway floor. "Nobody throws me and gets away with it. That was just a fluke, and now you're going to pay for embarrassing me in front of everyone." The threat was delivered with renewed menace, but perceptive observers could detect subtle changes in his body language that suggested his confidence had been badly shaken by his first experience with Keiko's technical skills. His stance was less aggressive and more defensive, his movements more cautious and calculated, and his eyes showed the kind of wariness that comes from suddenly discovering that previously reliable assumptions about strength and dominance might be completely incorrect. Brad had been recording the entire confrontation on his phone, initially to capture what he expected would be Tank's easy victory over their long-term target. But as he reviewed the footage of the throw that had just occurred, his expression shifted from excitement to something approaching analytical fascination. His academic mind was beginning to process the technical sophistication of what Keiko had demonstrated, and he found himself genuinely curious about the depth of knowledge and training that would be required to execute such a movement with apparent effortlessness. "Tank, maybe you should think about this," he said quietly, moving closer to his friend while keeping his eyes on Keiko's positioning and body language. "That wasn't luck or accident. That was real technique, and she made it look easy. Maybe we should reconsider our approach here." But Tank was beyond the reach of reasonable counsel, his ego and public image having sustained damage that demanded immediate restoration regardless of the practical risks involved. The watching students represented his entire social universe, and their perception of his strength and authority determined his status within the complex hierarchy that governed teenage life at Lincoln Technical High School. To walk away now would be to accept permanent diminishment of his position and influence, a consequence that seemed worse than whatever physical discomfort might result from continued confrontation. "Shut up, Brad," he snapped without taking his eyes off Keiko, who had returned to her ready stance with the same calm composure that she had maintained throughout the entire incident. "She got lucky with one move, but size and strength still matter. I'm going to finish this properly this time." His second approach was more cautious, but no more technically sound than his first attempt had been. Tank circled slightly to his right, apparently trying to prevent Keiko from using the same throwing technique that had proven so effective moments earlier. But his understanding of martial arts strategy was so limited that he failed to recognize how his new positioning actually created different opportunities for someone with comprehensive training in multiple categories of technique. Keiko tracked his movement with the patient observation of a chess master watching an opponent make predictable tactical errors. Her grandmother had taught her that most untrained fighters had repertoires of only 3 or 4 basic attacks, and that someone with proper preparation could anticipate and counter each option with techniques that had been practiced thousands of times until they became automatic responses that required no conscious decision-making. When Tank finally committed to his second attack, launching himself forward in what he probably imagined was an unpredictable rushing assault, Keiko was already moving to intercept him with a different technique that would demonstrate an entirely new category of her capabilities. This time, instead of throwing him over her hip, she chose to showcase the foot sweep known as the ashibarai, a technique that required even more precise timing and distance management, but which would prove equally devastating to someone who lacked the balance and awareness to defend against it. The sweep caught Tank's leading foot at exactly the moment when his weight was transferring forward onto that leg, eliminating his base of support with surgical precision while his momentum carried his upper body forward into empty space where his foot was no longer available to provide stability. The result was even more spectacular than the first throw, sending Tank crashing to the floor with significantly more force and less control than Keiko had allowed during their previous exchange. This time, the impact was hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs and leave him gasping on the floor, while the crowd erupted in exclamations of amazement and disbelief that someone so small could repeatedly overwhelm someone so much larger with such apparent ease. The transformation that swept through Lincoln Technical High School's hallways in the immediate aftermath of Tank's second devastating encounter with the floor was nothing short of seismic, rippling outward from the epicenter of the confrontation like waves from a stone dropped into still water. The video footage that had been captured on dozens of phones began circulating through social media platforms with viral velocity, carrying with it a narrative that challenged every assumption the student body had maintained about power, strength, and the nature of true capability. Within minutes of the confrontation's conclusion, Keiko found herself surrounded by students who had previously treated her as invisible or irrelevant, their faces displaying mixtures of awe, curiosity, and the kind of nervous respect typically reserved for celebrities or authority figures. The transformation in their behavior was so dramatic and immediate that it created an almost surreal atmosphere, as if she had suddenly become a different person rather than simply revealing aspects of herself that had always existed beneath the surface. "That was incredible," breathed Sarah Martinez, a junior who had never spoken directly to Keiko despite sharing 3 classes with her over the past 2 years. "Where did you learn to do that? I mean, Tank is huge, and you made it look so easy." Her voice carried genuine admiration, mixed with the kind of bewilderment that comes from witnessing something that contradicts fundamental beliefs about how the world operates. Similar conversations erupted throughout the growing crowd as students who had previously accepted Tank's dominance as a natural law began reassessing their understanding of strength, intimidation, and the complex social dynamics that governed their daily interactions. The reversal had been so complete and so publicly documented that denial was impossible, forcing everyone present to confront the reality that their perceptions of both Keiko and Tank had been fundamentally flawed. David Kim, the same student who had recognized capoeira techniques in the original story that had inspired this moment, pushed through the crowd with an expression of academic excitement that bordered on reverence. "Those were classical judo techniques," he announced to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose own martial arts background allowed him to appreciate the technical sophistication of what he had witnessed. Ukeaigoshi, and Diashibarai, executed with competition-level precision. That wasn't self-defense or lucky improvisation. That was years of serious training. His analysis sparked additional discussions among students who began sharing their own experiences. With martial arts, sports, and other activities that required dedication and technical mastery, the conversations revealed a hidden appreciation for discipline and authentic skill that had been overshadowed by the school's emphasis on superficial social hierarchies and the kind of popularity that was based more on image than substance. Meanwhile, Tank remained on the floor longer than his physical condition actually required, his mind struggling to process the complete demolition of his worldview and social status. The fall itself had been painful but not seriously injurious, yet the psychological impact of being so thoroughly outclassed in front of his entire peer group created a form of shock that was far more debilitating than any physical discomfort. Every aspect of his identity had been built around the assumption that his size and aggressive personality made him untouchable within the school's social ecosystem, and the revelation that these advantages were meaningless against genuine skill had left him emotionally paralyzed. Jessica and Devon stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, their usual confidence and cruel enthusiasm replaced by expressions of genuine fear as they realized that their association with Tank's humiliation might have serious consequences for their own social standing. The group dynamic that had made them feel powerful and secure was disintegrating in real time, and neither of them possessed the individual charisma or leadership abilities necessary to maintain their elevated status without Tank's intimidating presence to enforce their authority. Brad, whose analytical nature had allowed him to recognize the technical sophistication of Keiko's techniques more quickly than his companions, found himself in the unusual position of being genuinely impressed by someone he had previously dismissed as intellectually and socially inferior. His academic pride was based on the assumption that intelligence and knowledge were the primary sources of meaningful power, and discovering that Keiko possessed expertise in an area he knew nothing about forced him to reconsider his understanding of competence and achievement. The timing and distance management required for those techniques, he said quietly to Jessica, his voice carrying the kind of respectful analysis typically reserved for discussing advanced mathematical theorems or scientific discoveries, indicates a level of training that goes far beyond casual instruction. She's been studying with someone who really knows what they're doing, probably for years. The administrative response to the incident was swift, but complicated by the clear video evidence that Tank had initiated both phases of the physical confrontation, while Keiko had responded with defensive techniques that, while devastatingly effective, had been carefully controlled to avoid causing serious injury. Principal Williams arrived on the scene, accompanied by 2 security guards and the school nurse. But his usual protocol for handling fights required significant modification. When faced with circumstances that didn't fit standard categories of student violence, "Miss Nakamura," he said formally, his tone reflecting the careful neutrality of someone who understood that the situation contained legal and administrative complexities that required delicate handling, "I need you to come with me to discuss what happened here. Mr. Rodriguez, you'll need medical evaluation before we can proceed with any disciplinary conversations." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly as administrative authority asserted itself, but the energy and excitement generated by the confrontation continued to pulse through the building's corridors like electricity through wire. Students who had witnessed the events firsthand became instant celebrities, surrounded by classmates eager to hear detailed accounts of exactly what had happened and how the quiet scholarship student had managed to defeat the school's most intimidating bully with such apparent ease. In her chemistry class, which took place 2 periods after the hallway confrontation, Keiko found herself the center of attention in ways that felt both gratifying and overwhelming. Mrs. Henderson, who had previously treated her with benign neglect, now seemed eager to engage her in discussions about molecular structures and reaction mechanisms, as if discovering her martial arts abilities had somehow enhanced her credibility as a science student. "Miss Nakamura," the teacher said during a discussion of equilibrium reactions, "perhaps you could share your thoughts on how the principle of dynamic balance might apply to systems under stress." The question was clearly designed to allow Keiko to draw connections between her demonstrated physical skills and academic concepts, creating an opportunity for integration that hadn't existed before her. Public revelation. The transformation in classroom dynamics was immediately apparent to everyone present. Students who had previously ignored her contributions began listening attentively when she spoke, treating her observations and questions with the kind of respect typically reserved for acknowledged experts. The change was so dramatic that it created an almost intoxicating sense of empowerment. Though Keiko's training had prepared her to maintain perspective and avoid allowing external validation to compromise her internal balance, during lunch period, the cafeteria environment that had once been a source of daily stress and isolation became something approaching a celebration of her newly revealed identity. Multiple tables called out invitations for her to join their groups, and several students approached her directly to ask questions about martial arts training, competition experiences, and the philosophy behind the techniques she had demonstrated. "I've been thinking about taking self-defense classes," said Amanda Foster, a sophomore who had previously been among Jessica's circle of followers, but who now seemed eager to distance herself from that association. "Do you think judo would be a good choice for someone who's not naturally athletic? I mean, you're not exactly built like a typical fighter, but you obviously know what you're doing." The question reflected a broader shift in how students were beginning to think about strength, capability, and the relationship between physical appearance and actual competence. Keiko's demonstration had challenged assumptions that went far beyond martial arts, forcing her classmates to reconsider their understanding of what made someone powerful or worthy of respect. The most significant transformation, however, was occurring within Keiko herself. The years of hiding her abilities and enduring harassment while maintaining perfect self-control had created internal pressures that she hadn't fully recognized until they were finally released through decisive action. The relief of no longer needing to pretend weakness or vulnerability was profound, but it was accompanied by new responsibilities and expectations that would require careful navigation. Her conversation with her grandmother that evening took place in an atmosphere of quiet satisfaction, mixed with awareness that the day's events had fundamentally altered her situation at school in ways that would require ongoing attention and wisdom to manage properly. Hiromi listened to her granddaughter's account of the confrontation with the careful attention of someone who understood both the immediate significance and the long-term implications of what had occurred. "You chose well, Mago," she said finally, using the familiar term of endearment while pouring tea with the same ceremonial precision that characterized all her important conversations. The situation had reached a point where continued patience would have enabled further escalation rather than preventing it. Sometimes the most peaceful response is to demonstrate strength clearly enough that future challenges become unnecessary. The wisdom contained in her grandmother's analysis helped Keiko understand that her actions had been not just personally liberating, but strategically sound, creating conditions that would likely prevent rather than encourage future confrontations. The complete nature of Tank's defeat and the public documentation of her capabilities would serve as powerful deterrents to anyone else who might consider targeting her for harassment or intimidation. But perhaps most importantly, the day had marked her transition from hiding her true self to embracing her identity openly and confidently, setting the stage for the kind of authentic relationships and meaningful contributions that had been impossible when she was forced to maintain a facade of helplessness and vulnerability. The ripple effects of that transformative April morning continued to reshape the social landscape of Lincoln Technical High School with an intensity and permanence that surprised even those who had witnessed the original confrontation. 3 weeks after Tank's humiliating encounter with the hallway floor, the changes had become so deeply embedded in the school's culture that students who hadn't been present for the actual events still understood that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power and respect that governed their daily interactions. Tank himself had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone involved in the incident. The aggressive swagger and casual cruelty that had once defined his public persona had been replaced by a subdued wariness that reflected his new understanding of his actual position in the school's hierarchy. His physical size remained unchanged, but the psychological aura of intimidation that had made him such an effective bully had evaporated so completely that even freshman students no longer seemed particularly concerned about crossing his path. In crowded hallways, the video footage of his defeats had achieved the kind of viral status that ensured his humiliation would follow him far beyond the boundaries of Lincoln Technical High School. College recruiters who had previously expressed interest in his athletic abilities began asking pointed questions about his character and leadership potential, while teammates on the football squad started questioning whether someone who could be so easily handled by a girl half his size really deserved his position as a team leader and defensive captain. More significantly, Tank had been forced to confront the reality that his years of bullying behavior had created genuine enemies among the student body, people who now felt emboldened to speak openly about incidents that had previously been endured in silence. The administration found itself dealing with a flood of complaints about his past conduct, creating a pattern of documented harassment that would have serious implications for his academic standing and extracurricular participation. "I keep thinking about what she said," Tank confided to Brad during one of their increasingly rare conversations, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance or certainty, "about how I should have stopped when she asked nicely. She gave me multiple chances to walk away, and I was too stupid and proud to take them. Now everyone knows that all my tough guy reputation was just hot air." Brad, whose own social status had been damaged by association with Tank's disgrace, found himself genuinely sympathetic to his friend's predicament while also recognizing the justice inherent in the situation. His analytical mind had spent considerable time studying the video footage and researching judo techniques, leading him to a deep appreciation for the technical sophistication and restraint that Keiko had demonstrated throughout the confrontation. "The really impressive thing," he observed with the kind of academic objectivity that had always characterized his approach to complex problems, "is how controlled her responses were. She could have seriously injured you with those techniques, but she chose to use just enough force to end the threat without causing lasting damage. That level of precision requires not just technical skill, but genuine wisdom about when and how to apply it." Jessica and Devin had responded to the group's dissolution in characteristically different ways that reflected their individual personalities and coping mechanisms. Jessica had attempted to rebuild her social standing by distancing herself from Tank's failures while positioning herself as someone who had always harbored private doubts about the group's treatment of other students. Her efforts at reputation rehabilitation included public apologies to some of their former targets and expressions of admiration for Keiko's courage and skill. Devin, meanwhile, had withdrawn almost completely from the social dynamics that had previously consumed most of his attention and energy. The discovery that someone he had viewed as weak and vulnerable possessed capabilities that far exceeded his own had shattered his confidence in his ability to read people and situations accurately. He spent increasing amounts of time in the library, focusing on academic work and avoiding the kind of social interactions that might expose him to the kind of humiliation he had once inflicted on others. The transformation in how other students treated Keiko was perhaps the most visible and dramatic change in the school's social ecosystem. The girl who had once been invisible, except when serving as a target for harassment, had become something approaching a celebrity. with underclassmen seeking her advice on everything from study strategies to dealing with bullying, and upperclassmen expressing genuine interest in her perspectives on topics ranging from martial arts, philosophy to the immigrant experience in American high schools. The judo club that Principal Williams had initially suggested as a diplomatic gesture had evolved into one of the school's most popular and successful extracurricular activities. Keiko's demonstration of technical excellence had attracted students from diverse backgrounds and athletic abilities, creating a community that valued discipline, respect, and mutual improvement over the competitive hierarchy and individual achievement that characterized most other sports programs. "What I love about judo," explained Maria Santos, a senior who had joined the club despite having no previous martial arts experience, "is that it's not about being the strongest or the most aggressive person in the room. It's about understanding leverage, timing, and how to use someone's own energy against them. Keiko has taught us that real power comes from knowledge and preparation, not from intimidation or volume." The club's success had attracted attention from the Regional Judo Federation, leading to invitations for Keiko to train with elite coaches and compete in tournaments that could provide pathways to college, scholarships, and national-level recognition. But perhaps more importantly, it had created an environment where students who had previously felt powerless or marginalized could develop genuine confidence and self-defense capabilities under the guidance of someone who understood both the technical and psychological aspects of effective training. Hiromi had watched these developments with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose long-term vision was finally coming to fruition. Her decision to train her granddaughter in traditional martial arts had always been motivated by goals that went far beyond simple self-defense, encompassing character development, cultural preservation, and the cultivation of leadership qualities that could benefit entire communities rather than just individual practitioners. "You have become a teacher now, Mago," she observed during one of their evening conversations, her weathered hands gesturing toward newspaper clippings and school newsletters that documented the positive changes occurring at Lincoln Technical High School. "This was always the true purpose of your training, though neither of us could have predicted exactly how the opportunity would present itself." The academic benefits of Keiko's new social status were immediate and substantial. Teachers who had previously overlooked her contributions began actively soliciting her input during class discussions, recognizing that her demonstrated excellence in one challenging discipline suggested capabilities that extended into other areas of study. Her grades, which had always been solid, improved to exceptional levels as she found herself able to participate more fully in classroom activities without fear of harassment or social retaliation. College recruitment letters began arriving with increasing frequency as news of her judo achievements spread through academic and athletic networks. Admissions officers who valued diversity and unique perspectives were particularly interested in her combination of martial arts expertise, academic excellence, and the kind of personal story that demonstrated resilience and character under pressure. Perhaps the most meaningful transformation was occurring in the broader school culture, where Keiko's example had inspired other students to embrace their own authentic identities and resist the pressure to conform to narrow social expectations. The quiet revolution that had begun with a single moment of decisive action had evolved into a movement that valued substance over image, character over popularity, and genuine achievement over superficial status markers. The art students who had previously hidden their creative work began displaying pieces that reflected their actual interests and abilities rather than creating safe, conventional projects designed to avoid criticism. Academic achievers stopped downplaying their intellectual accomplishments to fit in with anti-education peer pressure. Students from immigrant families began sharing their cultural traditions and perspectives more openly, contributing to classroom discussions and school events in ways that enriched the entire educational environment. Dr. Rachel Chun, the district's superintendent, visited Lincoln Technical High School, specifically to observe the changes that had been documented in reports from Principal Williams and various faculty members. Her conversations with students, teachers, and administrators revealed a transformation that went far beyond the resolution of a single bullying situation, encompassing improvements in academic performance, disciplinary incidents, and overall school climate that exceeded anything in her professional experience. "What we're seeing here," she explained during a presentation to the school board, "is a perfect example of how individual courage and authentic leadership can create positive changes that benefit entire communities." Miss Nakamura's actions didn't just solve her own problems. They inspired a cultural shift that has made Lincoln Technical a better place for everyone. The recognition extended beyond the local education community to include features in regional newspapers and martial arts publications that celebrated Keiko's story as an example of how traditional training methods could produce not just technical excellence but the kind of character development that created positive leaders and community builders. As graduation approached, Keiko found herself reflecting on the journey that had transformed her from an invisible target of harassment into a respected leader and role model. The girl who had once hidden her abilities out of fear and uncertainty had discovered that authenticity and courage were far more powerful than any attempt to blend in or avoid conflict through submission. Her grandmother's wisdom about patience, timing, and the appropriate use of strength had proven correct in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated, creating opportunities for growth and contribution that would have been impossible if she had continued to hide her true capabilities and character. The quiet revolution that had begun with torn fabric and scattered notebooks had become a lasting transformation that would influence Lincoln Technical High School for years to come, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single person's decision to stop accepting treatment that falls short of basic human dignity and respect. 5 years later, Keiko stood before a packed auditorium at the International Youth Leadership Conference, her black belt tied with the same careful precision her grandmother had taught her in their basement dojo. Behind her, a projection screen displayed the now famous hallway footage that had been viewed millions of times worldwide, becoming a symbol of quiet strength overcoming loud aggression. "That moment taught me something profound," she told the audience of young people from 43 countries. "Real power isn't about making others feel small. It's about lifting them up while standing firm in your own truth." In the front row sat her grandmother Hiromi, now 83 but still radiating the same quiet dignity that had shaped Keiko's character. Beside her were former classmates who had become teachers, social workers, and advocates, all carrying forward the lessons learned in that transformative hallway confrontation. Tank sat 3 rows back, his own journey from bully to anti-bullying advocate having taken him through years of difficult self-reflection and community service. The humiliation that had once seemed like the end of his world had become the beginning of genuine growth and purpose. "The strongest people I know," Keiko continued, "are those who choose kindness even when they could choose dominance, who defend others even when they could simply protect themselves, who understands that true martial arts, true strength, is about creating peace, not conflict." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but the real victory was in the changed lives and communities that would carry these lessons forward for generations to come. If this story inspired you to believe in the power of quiet strength and authentic courage, please hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories of transformation and triumph to light. What's your own story of finding strength you didn't know you had? Share it in the comments below. We read every single one.